Hey guys, we are on Problem of Evil lesson number 2 this week. You guys, we're going to be back in our 3 discussion groups you guys had when I got here this week. So the invitation that you got should be the group that you're actually with: high school girls, or middle school guys. Um, the lesson this week should be a little bit easier to comprehend. Like I said, last week was kind of the most challenging, so the next 5 should be easier. But there is a danger in this lesson, and a temptation for improper, incorrect thoughts about who God is and how He loves us. And so that's part of your responsibility this week, is to kind of reinforce these 2 guardrails that I'm going to set up in my lesson to make sure that we're not venturing off, kind of bumping against them and running off a cliff, so to speak, in our thoughts about God. So as long as we stay between these 2 things, the argument should flow rather simply, and it's should make sense. But if we press too hard against one or the other, we could end up in trouble. So know these 2 guardrails, be ready to defend them, and you guys are going to have some time of discussion over these. But the 2 guardrails are, number 1, that the best possible thing for us as humans is to know God and to love Him. So we have to accept that in order to accept this argument, that the best thing for us as humans is to know God, to love Him, to worship Him, to have a relationship with Him. And then secondly, that we are super sinful people. Humans are just inherently sinful, and that sin and sinful nature goes a lot deeper than we often like to admit as humans. So protect those 2 guardrails, keep them inside of those 2, and this argument should make sense. So the argument is going to be that God sometimes, and that's another key, that this is only sometimes, God sometimes uses pain and suffering as a megaphone, so to speak, in order to get our attention, to highlight our need for God, to direct us towards God. So sometimes pain and suffering comes into our lives, and God allows that in hopes that that directs us towards Him. And so this happens because of how sinful we are, because we ignore a lot of the less painful methods to get to God. And so we ignore beauty in creation, we ignore the pleasures of life, food, drink, companionship, things that God has blessed us with. We ignore blessings in our lives, we ignore the moral law that we talked about last week. We ignore warnings from friends and from family and from pastors about God and His judgment, and we ignore all of these easy and good things that could point us towards God, and we often just kind of brush them off as sinners, as people that don't have a relationship with God. We'll just brush those off and not even think twice about who God is in those good times. But pain kind of has a way of stopping us in our tracks, and it makes us stop and think and handle these questions, and sometimes it opens up our eyes to all of those other things, the warnings that we were getting, the signs that we were seeing. And this works out in regular life too, and I think that's the easiest way to see it. And there's a ton of examples. I might use a couple on Sunday, but a good one is a high school girl that wants to date this other guy in high school, and he's got a bad reputation. He's not a great guy. And so her friends know that, and her friends are warning her, don't date this guy. He's done this, this, and this. He's not good. Look at what he did to that last girl. You shouldn't date him. And so she gets warnings, and then there are signs that this guy's a bad guy, like it's not really a secret. People can see that. It's easily perceived that he's not a good dude, but yet she still goes forward and dates him, of course. And it's often not until something bad happens that she has to step back and really reckon with all of that she heard. So it's not until he breaks her heart or cheats on her or treats her poorly that she actually steps back and sees, maybe all these warnings were right, maybe all these signs that I was seeing were right, and she actually has to answer up to those questions. Oftentimes it's not until we experience pain and suffering that we actually deal with these things. And so the same thing happens in our spirituality, that we're so thick-headed and so sinful that we won't accept these easy, good pathways to God. And sometimes it's only through pain and suffering that we can find our way there. And we hear this all the time in testimonies. People come to God a lot of times when they hit rock bottom in their lives, and they didn't give a second thought about God when things were going well, but when things start to go south, they have to answer these questions, and oftentimes that can lead us towards God. And so sometimes pain and suffering in our lives, God allows that in hopes that it will direct us towards Him. And so again, you have to understand that we're so sinful that that's necessary. And you also have to understand that God doing that is not God being selfish or jealous in a bad way, but that's God being loving, and he's actually seeking out what's ultimately best for us, which is to know him and to have a relationship with him. So if we accept those two things, it all falls together nicely. If we can't accept one of those, then it gives us some poor thoughts about who God is. So in your discussion questions, you're going to open, just like you did last week, with questions from students. Allow this time to go on as long as it needs to. If it takes the whole time, that's fine. If students have questions, answer them as best as you can. And hopefully that means they're engaging with the lesson and that they're interested and want to know more. So spend as much time on that as you need. The second one, you're going to ask, challenge students to see if they can think in the Bible of how this plays out, if we see any examples of this in Scripture. And this is actually harder than you might think, because a lot of times pain and suffering as punishment from God and pain and suffering as a megaphone from God kind of mesh together, and they're hard to untangle sometimes. I've listed a couple examples for you here. I think the best one for me is King Nebuchadnezzar, which is probably a much lesser known example from both students and leaders, but he is kind of this classic example of he ignores all these things that should have pointed him towards God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go into a furnace and come out, and they're not dead, and he ignores that, and he ignores these consistent dreams that God sends him. And then Daniel, a man of God, comes and interprets, and they're all pushing him towards God, and he easily just brushes those off. And it's not until in chapter 4 when God just strips the kingdom from him and tells him, you're going to go out and live in the wilderness with nothing. And so when God takes everything from him, that's when he actually turns and really submits his life to the Lord in chapter 4. So I think that's the best example. There are some other ones there. You guys check that out and just pick the one that you're comfortable with and see if students will hit on any others. Third question, I don't know if you guys use this phrase here, but in the South people say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They say that all the time, and I think that's a good encapsulation of what this lesson is. That's how we live our lives oftentimes before we come to Christ, that if things aren't broken, why would I need to change? That's really how a lot of people live their lives. As long as things are going well, as long as I'm blessed, as long as things are mostly in order, why would I need this radical change of submitting to God? And it's not until things really break down and they really experience problems that they even turn to God for a solution. So that's just kind of a reinforcement of the lesson, another way to think about it. And then question number 4, have students, and you guys can help read these scripture passages. So there's 3 for each. And this is just support for those 2 guardrails. So biblical support that knowing God is the best thing for us, and then biblical support of our sinfulness and how deep that actually goes. And so this just reinforces those guardrails, hopefully better for us. Question number 5. I'm going to open with kind of challenging their idea of what love is, and you guys are just going to kind of build on that. And so we're kind of fighting against the idea that love is just kindness or acceptance towards one another, but that love is seeking what's best for the person that you love. And so sometimes seeking what's best for the person that you love involves painful measures, and parents should know this, and there's clear examples of that. And the same thing goes for God, that he loves us, and even though he loves us, that sometimes directs him to discipline us, that sometimes directs him to allow pain and suffering in our lives to hopefully actually direct us towards what's best for us. And so this pushes against the culture's definition of love. And you guys, that's what question 6 is. It's just kind of discussing what do people generally think love is today. And a lot of times that's tolerance or acceptance or kindness towards one another, and it kind of eliminates and cuts off this aspect of pain and suffering, of seeking what's best for the person that you love, even if the getting there might be painful. And so that's pushing against just the culture's idea of love. Could be some really interesting discussion there. But yeah, those are the questions for you guys this week. If you have any extra questions, if you don't understand the argument, if you need some extra support in something, feel free to contact me and I can help you guys out. But I'll see you on Sunday.